This is an urgent breaking news bulletin. Federal agents have just executed a series of high stakes raids across a major southern coastal city, bringing down a massive public corruption and nonprofit fraud scheme that investigators say moved nearly $1 billion. We are tracking a major coordinated operation involving multiple federal agencies, with the FBI taking the lead on a public corruption probe that has just shattered the facade of a major charitable organization. If you live in or around this region, what we are about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about the people you trust to run your government. Federal agents simultaneously descended upon the homes and offices of key figures connected to a powerful coastal administration and a nationally recognized disaster relief nonprofit. Search warrants were carried out, doors were breached, and at least 36 individuals are now in federal custody. The target at the center of this alleged criminal conspiracy? None other than the city's sitting, two-term mayor, Wendell Carrick. A former state legislator with a platform built almost exclusively on his image as a champion of disaster preparedness and Gulf Coast community resilience, Carrick has now been arrested and charged with orchestrating a massive, multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that allegedly exploited vulnerable communities for over a decade. He wasn't alone. Alongside him, the foundation's longtime executive director, Marvin Trell, and a former high-ranking federal official have also been swept up in the dragnet. This wasn't just small-time embezzlement. The LA Times and our sources are reporting this was a long-term public corruption probe involving a dual-purpose financial vehicle, the Southern Hands Foundation. For 13 years, the foundation presented itself as a savior to communities devastated by hurricanes and floods across the Gulf Coast. Millions of well-meaning citizens, corporate sponsors, and philanthropists donated over $400 million. But federal investigators allege that approximately 80% of those legitimate donations were quietly redirected into a layered system of contractor invoices, fabricated field reports, and offshore wire transfers. The donation theft layer alone is staggering, allegedly diverting $320 million away from real disaster relief work. But the true scale of the crime is even larger. What will shock you to your core is that donation theft wasn't the larger half of this operation. The true blockbuster allegation is laundering. The Southern Hands Foundation, while publicly accepting humanitarian awards and humanitarian checks, was also allegedly receiving structured financial inflows from a major cartel money laundering network operating across the entire Gulf region and northern Latin America. The foundation that claimed to serve hurricane survivors was in practice alleged to be stealing from them twice, once by pocketing their donations, and again by laundering the very drug proceeds, fueling the criminal organizations that terrorize the region. This is betrayal on an unprecedented scale. Stay right here, because in this video we're going to expose how this vast, multi-jurisdictional operation remained invisible for 13 years, protected by a brilliant former federal insider who had written the very compliance rules she was now quietly breaking. To fully understand how a nonprofit fraud network could scale into a nearly $1 billion empire, you have to look directly at the central figure who weaponized public trust, Mayor Wendell Carrick. For 13 years, the 59-year-old two-term sitting mayor of a major coastal city in the southern United States was the untouchable, gold standard champion of disaster preparedness and Gulf Coast community resilience. Former state legislator, humanitarian award winner, a master politician who personally appeared on national news broadcasts, standing in front of catastrophic hurricane wreckage, pointing to the Southern Hands Foundation logo on his polo shirt while pleading for American generosity. He was the perfect public face, raising over $400 million in publicly disclosed donations across a 13-year operational history. But behind that impeccably tailored, philanthropic facade lay a cold, calculated operation. The Southern Hands Foundation was never a legitimate charity. It was operating as a highly sophisticated, dual-purpose financial vehicle designed to steal from the vulnerable and clean dirty cash for international syndicates. The scheme operated on two distinct devious layers. The first was the donation theft layer, managed directly on the operational interior by the foundation's longtime executive director, Marvin Trell. At 54 years old, Trell was a former senior development officer at two legitimate international relief organizations, a man whose elite credentials made the foundation appear completely unimpeachable to outside auditors. Under Trell's supervision, only 20% of the legitimate public donations were ever deployed into actual disaster relief activity, just enough to maintain a defensible operational footprint, fund public relations campaigns, and produce heartbreaking field photography to satisfy donors. The remaining 80% of all incoming charitable funds was quietly systematically gutted. Trell utilized a complex, layered system of fabricated field deployment reports, ghost contractor invoices for emergency relief logistics that had no real operational footprint, and wire transfer authorizations that moved money offshore. In total, this donation theft layer successfully siphoned $320 million in legitimate donor funds out of the country and into a consolidated set of accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. But as massive as that theft was, federal prosecutors reveal it wasn't even the larger half of the conspiracy. The second, far more dangerous layer of the architecture was international laundering. For over a decade, those exact same offshore consolidation accounts was receiving massive structured inflows from a major cartel money laundering network operating across the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean, and northern Latin America. The scheme was diabolical. The cartel funneled illicit narcotics distribution proceeds into the offshore nonprofit infrastructure, where it was mixed with legitimate, stolen charitable donations, and then cleaned through international banking routing patterns. But how did a sitting mayor and a nonprofit executive pull this off for 13 years without triggering a single red flag? They had a secret weapon. The entire protection layer of the architecture was designed by someone with deep, prior federal law enforcement experience. Lillian Voss. At 63 years old, Voss was the former director of tax-exempt and government entities at the Internal Revenue Service, preceded by 16 years as a senior policy advisor at FinCEN, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. She was literally the top federal expert in nonprofit sector laundering patterns. She had personally written internal IRS guidance on how to detect charity fraud, testified before congressional committees on cartel financial flows, and helped design the very compliance frameworks used to audit disaster relief organizations. Within 8 months of her federal retirement, Mayor Carrick quietly retained her as a private advisor through a corporate shell cover called Coastal Compliance Strategies LLC. Inside the encrypted communication archives later recovered by the FBI, her code name was The Administrator. Her philosophy was chillingly simple, as she wrote to her co-conspirators. Disaster relief nonprofits are audited for compliance with deployment documentation, not for whether the deployments actually occurred. Our work is to make the documentation airtight. The work behind the documentation does not have to exist. With Voss crafting flawless, bulletproof paperwork, Carrick holding the public trust, and Trell running the daily diversions, the network built a multi-million-dollar financial fortress that completely blinded federal oversight protocols. They thought they were invisible. They thought their system was foolproof. What they didn't realize was that an insider was already sitting at their boardroom table, quietly documenting every single move. The fortress of invisibility that Mayor Wendell Carrick, Marvin Trell, and Lillian Voss built over 13 years did not collapse because of a routine federal audit or a flaw in their airtight documentation. It collapsed because of a single courageous insider who decided to break the silence. Her name was Esperanza Reyes. At 47 years old, Reyes was a highly qualified member of the executive board of the Southern Hands Foundation, holding a master's degree in public health and a decade of experience with legitimate international relief organizations. Recruited by the mayor himself, after impressing him at an emergency management conference, she joined the board genuinely intending to do the vital recovery work the foundation claimed to spearhead. But by her 4th year on the board, she began noticing the anomalies. Field deployment reports detailed relief operations in regions where her personal professional contacts had no memory of any foundation presence. Donor reports featured photographs of aid distributions that could not be verified. Contractor invoices named logistics vendors with absolutely no real-world operational footprint. Most damning of all, she discovered wire transfer authorizations moving donor funds offshore through complex routing patterns that completely bypassed legitimate international relief infrastructure. By her 6th year, Reyes realized the horrifying truth. She was sitting at a boardroom table where every single person except her was in on the conspiracy. She spent seventh year quietly preparing, gathering intel without alerting a soul. Then, on a Wednesday morning in the early spring of her eighth year, she walked directly into the FBI's regional field office and asked to speak with a senior special agent on the Public Corruption Squad. For the next 14 months, Reyes became the federal government's ultimate weapon. She courageously agreed to keep attending the meetings, keep voting on the corrupt authorizations, and keep showing up at high-profile foundation events, acting as an undercover operative inside a billion-dollar cartel-linked network. According to court documents and federal sources, the Public Corruption Squad used her access to map the entire financial trail, wiretap communications, and build an ironclad criminal case. The climax of this grueling 14-month undercover operations exploded in spectacular fashion during the Foundation's annual signature event, the Southern Hands Foundation Gulf Coast Recovery Gala. It was a lavish black tie affair with 400 guests in attendance at a major coastal city hotel ballroom. The room was packed with senior local political figures, regional corporate sponsors, 2 members of Congress, and a 9-piece string orchestra playing as a 4-course dinner was served. A live broadcast feed was actively streaming the event to a national donor network. At exactly 8:47 p.m. that night, while the gala was in full swing, a federal judge signed simultaneous search and arrest warrants for 15 locations across the region. At 9:02 p.m., the tactical order went out. At 9:06 p.m., just 4 minutes into Mayor Wendell Carrick's keynote address, where he was delivering a practice speech about standing with communities in their darkest hours, the rear doors of the ballroom burst open. 8 FBI special agents in tactical jackets entered the ballroom in formation. As the string orchestra abruptly cut out and a stunned silence swept through the 400 guests, 4 agents marched directly up the center aisle toward the stage, while 4 others secured the perimeter. Mayor Carrick was arrested right at the podium in front of his entire donor network. Simultaneously, federal strike forces hit 14 other locations. Lillian Voss was arrested at her commercial office when agents breached her private residence. Sources indicate they discovered a highly secure home office server concealed inside a built-in cabinet in her library containing backup drives that spanned her entire 10-year history as the administrator. Agents also uncovered a wall safe packed with approximately $670,000 in cash, alongside a hidden floor compartment containing 4 foreign passports, 3 of which were issued under completely different names. 10 additional locations were hit simultaneously, including the registered offices of 7 shell companies, 2 cartel-affiliated logistics properties along the Gulf Coast, and the private residences of 3 corporate intermediaries who managed the offshore consolidation accounts. By 4:14 a.m. the following morning, the sweep was complete. 36 individuals were in federal custody, and a 13-year criminal empire had been dismantled in a matter of hours. The morning after the dramatic ballroom arrest, the true staggering scale of the fallout began to register. This wasn't just a local political scandal. It was one of the largest nonprofit takedowns in American history. Federal seizure orders came down with devastating speed. Domestically, federal agencies successfully froze a jaw-dropping $520 million in assets linked directly to the conspiracy. Through rapid international cooperation agreements, an additional $410 million sitting in offshore accounts across the Cayman Islands, Panama, and the Dominican Republic was flagged and placed under active legal recovery proceedings. The Foundation's executive headquarters, Mayor Wendell Carrick's private estate, Lillian Voss's fortified residence, 2 luxury Gulf Coast vacation properties, and the entire web of layered corporate holdings tied to Coastal Compliance Strategies LLC were seized by federal agents. The Southern Hands Foundation was immediately stripped of its operating status and placed to court-appointed receivership, completely freezing its financial structure as forensic accountants began the monumental task of unwinding 13 years of illicit transactions. The aftershocks instantly triggered a massive regulatory panic across the federal government. The IRS Office of Tax-Exempt and Government Entities announced an immediate, sweeping operational audit of disaster relief nonprofit oversight protocols across the entire southern United States. Simultaneously, FinCEN launched a parallel federal review targeting nonprofit sector cross-border donation patterns over the previous 15 years. The systemic vulnerabilities that Lillian Voss exploited to hide cartel cash are now forcing a complete rewrite of how charities are audited in America. but as the legal hearings begin and the 36 individuals face heavy federal indictments, we must look past the cinematic moment of the FBI marching into that black tie gala. The real story here belongs to Esperanza Reyes. She was not among the arrested. In fact, federal handlers had quietly moved her into protective custody 72 hours before the raid took place. While the Foundation Board was told she was simply recovering from a sudden minor illness, Reyes spent the night of the takedown sitting in a secure federal safehouse, watching the live broadcast feed as the corrupt system she fought for 5 years collapsed in real time. Think about the sheer courage it took. She didn't have to walk into that federal field office on a Wednesday morning. She didn't have to risk her life for 14 months, sitting across from smiling criminals, voting on fraudulent authorizations, and pretending everything was normal while wearing a virtual target on her back. She did it because she believed that bringing this corruption into the light mattered more than her own safety. For 13 years, this criminal network survived every routine IRS audit, every FinCEN check, and every state regulatory compliance framework because a brilliant former insider designed it to blind the system. It didn't survive a single board member who refused to look the other way. If a cartel-linked money laundering machine this massive could operate completely undetected for over a decade inside one of the most publicly admired charities on the Gulf Coast, moving nearly $1 billion under the guise of helping disaster survivors, it forces us to ask a terrifying question. How many other boardroom tables are hiding the exact same corruption tonight? How many other insiders are preparing to walk into an FBI field office to finally tell the truth? If you believe corruption like this must be exposed, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment EX post.